Welcome back, everyone. This is Rajkumari Neogy along with Sarah Peyton. We're here to talk about you, how you show up in the workplace, and how your brain impacts all of that. Today, we're going to talk about the intro to your hemispheres, what the left hemisphere does to you and with you, and what your right hemisphere does to you and with you, and how both of those put together creates the whole of you as you go about your day. Sarah.
Good morning.
Where should we start?
Well, let's just start with the just a little bit of a sense of the way that humans have seen the hemispheres.
Great.
Just a quick sense that there was a Nobel Prize that was awarded to Roger Sperry back within living memory for many of us when he started looking at split brain research and discovered that there were two very distinct ways that people would operate if they were located in their left hemisphere and if they were located in their right hemisphere. And this gave rise to all of those really fun books like Drawing with the Right Hemisphere and and it gave rise to kind of a lot of popularization and simplifying of the concepts of how we are left and right hemisphere humans. And what then became discovered as the research continued was that it wasn't quite that simple, that the left hemisphere does everything and the right hemisphere does everything, but that they are structurally different. And they look at the world in very different ways. So the way that the left hemisphere looks at the world is through the lens of its neurons, which are structured kind of the way an orchard is structured, with rows and columns and the order. And the right hemisphere is structured more like the neurons are structured more like the Amazon jungle, with neurons running everywhere and connecting everything.
So how we bring that back to the workplace would be in the left hemisphere we have people who are incredibly linear, who are data focused, who are wanting to do things that are step by step. Is that right?
Step by step, micromanagement, difficulty with kind of raising their head and seeing the big picture.
Big picture, yeah.
And so those only on their own responsibilities rather than seeing the workflow through the entire organization.
That's a very interesting piece. People who are only focused on their own responsibilities rather than what others are responsible for. I want to come back to that. Please continue.
And then, of course, people with the right hemisphere, we'll be talking a lot about regulation during this series, Rajkumari. People who have an unregulated right hemisphere, that's where temper tantrums show up, that's where depression raises its head, that's where we get emotionality that's not enjoyed and doesn't support clear expression and connection. That's the unregulated right hemisphere. And then we get the regulated right hemisphere, which is just a fabulous thing to have in the workplace, because then we see everything and know our place and how we contribute and have a sense of meaning, purpose, and connection.
Well, it would be really great if we could do an acronym with like URR and then put a P in front of it, so unregulated right hemisphere, and then PER, I don't know if we could do that, and then RRR, regulated right hemisphere. I don't know. That's what's coming up for me right now.
Just to have an easy way to talk about it instead of these long monikers, huh?
Yeah, and so this really is helping to understand why people are showing up aggressively in the workplace or hostile or in a stance of posturing, or if they're finding themselves frustrated or feeling anxious or just plain irritated. That seems to be the place of the unregulated right hemisphere. And so the question then becomes, as we develop culture, as we focus on growing culture, which is what my passion is, about looking at the disruptiveness of diversity, the disruptiveness of hiring, the disruptiveness of success, really, and innovation, through having really solid talent that's working collaboratively and cohesively, is to somehow get them all on this, in essence, page of self-regulation?
Well, both self-regulation and, interestingly enough, while, the intensity of emotion that you spoke about really comes out of that right hemisphere, the jockeying for status, the sense of territoriality, the need for respect and acknowledgement of precedence, all of these things are tracked by that left hemisphere. Our workplaces are very highly left hemisphere skewed, which is one of the reasons that people come wondering how to find meaning in their lives.
Wow, that's really powerful. And so the question then becomes, how do we begin to bridge the gap, if we can call it that for the moment, between the left and right hemisphere at the workplace? How do we get people to show up and do their job and feel the passion, feel the purpose? And in fact, one of the things that I talk about around diversity and inclusion is that diversity is about uniqueness, right? And the individual and who they are, how they show up in the world, how they show up in the workplace, how they show up in relation to their job. And then inclusion is about their contribution. What's their passion? What's their purpose? How are they being received? How are they being seen by themselves, their coworkers, and the team and the organization? And so that, for me, is true diversity and inclusion. And so the question I'd like to explore as we continue our conversation is, how do we get individuals to show up more fully in their right hemisphere, at least that 95%, because I think I heard you say in a past conversation that 5% of individuals actually have the reversed. Is that right?
Yes, their hemispheres are reversed, but it doesn't change the way that their brain functions. Their left hemisphere does what the right hemisphere
Got it.
do in others, yes.
So we're still trying to get them to show up fully no matter what,
right.
No matter how they're wired.
That is
Excellent. And so
exactly
this concept that I talked about many years ago during an interview, actually, for a company called QuantCom, is how do we become a whole person culture? Right? How do we bring that to the organizational level of culture? How do we impact the talent growth by bringing our full selves? And our full selves, for me, is not only the left and right hemisphere, but other elements as well, and we'll continue to explore that, like our spirit, our body, those different pieces that many of us tend to forget about in the moment if we're triaging or crisis management or having fun, playing beer pong. So these are the kind of the overarching themes that I think we'll look at addressing and exploring and kind of diving deeply into together, right? Is that right, Sarah? I hope so.
Exactly right. Yes, Rajkumari.
Fantastic. So please say more about how we can show up and start to bridge that gap between the left and the right and bring our whole selves, find our purpose, find our meaning. How do we do that knowing that we're wired to be, in essence, mostly reactive?
Well, it's important to acknowledge where we are in our workplace hierarchy, because just the way that brains are organized, single brains are organized, multiple brains tend to be organized also into a single kind of functional organizational brain. And the easiest place for change to come from is from the right prefrontal cortex, which is basically the management section of our brain. So change is easiest to implement if it is coming from the top. That's the very first thing to acknowledge.
That's hilarious, right?
Yeah.
That's hilarious, because what do we say when we walk in, when we are trying to convince someone to purchase our services or our product, and we want to effect change, whatever that service or product is? We always say that we must get the buy-in from leadership.
Yes.
From the head of the organization. That is absolutely fascinating to me. Please continue.
So if we can get our management on board, then the change can begin to happen, and in a much more quick and comprehensive way. Part of what comes with this kind of change is the movement between seeing people in their functional roles and seeing them as human. So acknowledgement, appreciation, respect, dignity, clarity, all of these kinds of communication attitudes are what really bring change to a workplace more than anything else. This happens in workplaces. It also happens in enormous institutions. For example, the Oregon prison system went out and doesn't have much money. They're not funded particularly intensely, and they went out and they discovered where were the places that had the lowest recidivism rates in the world, and they started looking at the cultures of those prisons, and discovered that there was an attitude of communication, respect between officers and inmates. And they brought that back to the Oregon prison system, and there's a culture of respect that it contributes, on a prison level, it contributes to lower recidivism rates. So any organization that people are in can be transformed by the whole person or whole brain approach. Whenever we're working with humans, if we bring respect and consideration into the picture, and acknowledgement and appreciation, these are very important. It can be difficult for someone who is kind of really focused on outcome and productivity and profit to turn their attention toward relationship. But if they do, then the rewards will be enormous.
I fully agree. In fact, as I'm reading all of the latest articles on Flipboard in the Valley, and also what's happening around the world, is primarily my focus right now is India and what's happening in the entrepreneurship arena there. And there's such a dearth of diversity as well. And looking at how we begin to bring that level of respectful communication or empathetic communication or compassionate communication to a degree where we're actually languaging appreciation in those sentences, that we're actually taking the time to say thank you. And it almost feels as though we're modeling, perhaps that's what the inmates and the guards were doing in the Oregon prison system, is they were being able and invited to, and perhaps even supported by some other curriculum or concept or method, to model respectful communication and to invite each other to show up very, very differently and really kind of be radical, wouldn't you say? In this way of showing up in a very closed and contracted and really restrictive environment. I mean, you are imprisoned. You can't get any more metaphorical from that institutional level. And to begin to step out of that, to literally find a way of openness through that entrapment, and to find this relational piece of bonding, right? They're in essence creating something we'll talk about later about oxytocin. They're creating relationships by language, through words, through nonverbal communication, that is in essence saying, I care.
Yes.
And not only do I care, but I care enough to slow down and to see you, as you say, Sarah, human.
Yes.
Even though you've committed these crimes, even though you've showed up in a way that goes against our laws and our regulations, you are still at the very core human.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's critical. And so how do we then translate that into this evolutionary organizational trajectory that we're headed into, this more inclusive way of relating? How do we do that? And how can we begin to take the actions and the steps that allow us to create these relational moments when the report is due and when there's a crisis that's happening, when productivity is failing on the stock market as it is being troubled right now? How do we begin to show up so that when our valuations are slashed in half, as that has recently happened by many of the firms here? We know also about FANG. FANG is Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, and their stocks have taken a hit collectively. How do we still stay afloat in our minds by continuing to connect from a human level?
Well, there is something that happens when we create some kind of reminder that the people that we are working with have their own lives and also have needs for respect and dignity. So one side of this coin, and we had spoken about how important it is for the management to be on board, but in addition, please notice that this radical invitation to noticing the humanity of others can happen at any level.
Absolutely.
There are three real prongs to this, to three different areas that are solid skills that we can implement and put little reminders to ourselves about. One is remembering one another's autobiography and revealing that we remember it. How is your husband? You know, how did the softball game go for your child? You know, making a reference to the last personal conversation.
And I want to just jump in here. So many articles that have been published on really successful leaders, CEOs in the company, so many of them write about exactly that. I walked the floor. I sat in the cafeteria. I ate lunch with my coworkers. I took the time to write a handwritten note. That level, is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And it's about autobiographical memory. That actually awakens the right hemisphere. When we're in our own autobiographical memory, when we're creating connection and remembering someone else's autobiography. Yep. So that's the first prong. The second prong is appreciation and acknowledgement. So acknowledging people for the work that they do, appreciating them, thanking them, being specific and clear about what they're being thanked for, rather than just "you're a great worker." You know, that is not.
Yeah.
You know, I really saw that you worked an hour later yesterday and finished that report, and I am so grateful. Thank you. Your work is seen and appreciated. That comes closer.
Right.
And then the third prong is noticing that there is a relationship and making the small repairs and check-ins about relational connection. This is an incredible super glue of connection. This is a super glue of creating right hemisphere, whole brain, whole person workplace experiences. Is if I go, Rajkumari, hey, I noticed that yesterday at the meeting you were speaking and I interrupted you, and I just remembered that and I just wanted to check in about it. Is there anything you need me to hear about how that was for you?
Wow, that just gave me goosebumps. You and I have been talking for a long time now, and one of the core elements of the disruptive diversity framework is, in fact, that. It's about the rupture and repair process, and addressing certain core needs that are essential for organizations to thrive, to have incredible vitality, and to really step into places of success and innovation. And in order to do that, this rupture and repair process, technique, skill set must be completely in place, I believe. And it must be fluid. It must just flow and roll off the tongue so that individuals are being able to really establish this threaded way of relationally being with everyone in the organization. It doesn't matter what department, where you are in the rank or the hierarchy, all of that becomes irrelevant. And to just do that very small step, I noticed, and I'm wondering if there's more, and if we can, connect around it, right?
Yep.
And that repair is just, I love the word superglue. I think I'm going to steal that and use that from now on. I've seen that in my own personal relationships. My romantic relationship, first and foremost, has been transformed over and over again every time we do the repair and rupture and repair process, and with friendships, and certainly, of course, in the workplace when I'm working with clients and when I'm working with teams. This level of connection even can be done non-verbally. A great way to practice this, which is what I'm using as a calibration method for my own process around this rupture and repair and creating relational ways of being, is simply to, when I'm at a restaurant, for example, to linger just a little bit longer, maybe a second and a half. I mean, this is not very long time, with the waitstaff who is bringing me or taking something, from my table. And what I have noticed, this level of connection, this level of slowing down and giving that person acknowledgement, if you will, is life transforming, at least for that experience at the restaurant. I get smiles by the third or fourth time. I get a lot more attention. I am brought things and asked if I need more things. It's if you want to have truly magical experiences at restaurants, take an extra second to make eye contact with the waitstaff. I'm telling you, try it out. It's amazing. and I'm just wondering, those are the things that you're also talking about? Yes, Sarah?
Oh, absolutely. All the little bits of remembering and noticing and connecting that create right hemisphere relational movement, connection.
Fantastic. Well, you've heard a little bit about what it's like to show up as a whole person and creating yourself both able to access your left and right hemisphere, and what that can do for you and ways that you can do that and how you can show up differently. Next episode, what are we going to talk about, Sarah? I'm going to pass the ball to you here.
Sure. In the next episode, we're going to talk about how important it is to accompany ourselves at work, how important it is to be our own ally and to develop what I call a compassionate and resonating self-witness.
Well, I cannot wait to jump into that conversation. For all of you, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us next time. Take care.